Seth, I think, is trying to connect also. Let's give it 2 or 3 more. I hope we can wait just a little bit longer.
I see that the print behind you, or is it an etching, also shows some rain, which may explain your interest in weather phenomenon. Do they have very different weather in Brussels?
Not at all. It's exactly the same as
exactly. Yeah.
Very often the same. Maybe a little bit warmer, but it's really sunny now. I have my curtains on.
Yeah.
This was it's a Zhezhen, it's a cartoon drawing actually.
Yes. I thought yes. Very nice. It's signed on the right bottom side, I see.
Yes, and it's 2 out of 10 prints.
It's a limited edition. It's just a number within an edition of 10. Yes, very nice. It's very hard to show rain in paintings or drawings. It's really.
This is almost Japanese, I think. Very graphic.
Yes. Well, it's the way it's kind of the diagonal is turning. It's kind of it's curving around, gives it an effect, I think. Yeah.
I see more.
So what do you think? Do we start?
I think
we have started. No.
Yes, we can.
Officially and formally.
I would like to suggest that we start. I mean, the more people join this, the smaller my face gets in this Zoom. So I think we should start before we lose sight of what it is really about. All this.
Yeah.
I'll let anyone that comes, I'll let them in anyway. So we can start and I'll take care of the people coming in, okay?
Okay.
So the idea is that we kick it off with a very brief 10 to 15-minute introduction by yours truly. So I'll try to share my screen. I hope yes, I think I can. Do you see my screen now?
Absolutely.
Yes, beautiful. So let me start, and I promise it won't be too long, but just to set the mood. So are we recording now, Doctor?
Yes, we are. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So welcome to our webinar on the epi-phylo-genetic turn and surroundings in memory of Bernard Stiegler. It is organized by the Ecologies of Architecture, TU Delft Architecture Theory Research Group, Heidi, Stavros, myself, in cooperation with the ArtEZ University of the Arts, represented by Marc Boumeester, my friend, and the surroundings lab network, Mads, Igea, Rike, and the company, which operates at the intersection of film and surroundings. My name is Andrej Radman, and I will be your host together with my colleague, architecture theorist Stavros Kousoulas, and the media theorist and filmmaker, Marc Boumeester. So, what is on the menu for the next 2 hours? First, the brief introduction to kick us off, and then followed by 5 questions or statements as the basis for the roundtable discussion. Before we start, a few preliminaries, which are actually shameless product placements. My colleague Robert Gorny, Bob, are you there? Just say something so that people can see you, please. Robert is, I think, here. I've seen him. So my colleague Robert Gorny and I have recently launched a call for contribution for an almost eponymous issue of Footprint, Delft Architecture Theory Journal. You're very welcome to respond to this call. If you're interested, please follow the link on the screen. The deadline is the 15th of February, 2021, next year. Stavros and I are also happy to inform you that we have just submitted, literally like 2 or 3 days ago, a typescript of a book project named Architectures of Life and Death, to be published by Roman and Littlefield International, which was partially influenced by Stiegler's work. The main thesis of the book boils down to the following statement: the animate has always been utterly dependent on the inanimate or epigenetic. Lastly, this is out of courtesy, we want to inform you of an upcoming event, Memory of the Future, Memory for the Future, Thinking with Bernard Stiegler, on the 3rd and 4th December this year. And this event is organized by Leiden and Nijmegen universities with a very impressive lineup of speakers. And I thought some of them would be with us today, but I'm not sure if they are. So preliminaries aside, we now turn to the introduction in the format of a glossary. Let us start with the title itself, Epi-phylo-genetic Turn and Surroundings. According to Stiegler, we transform our surroundings as much as they transform us. So this is at an accelerated pace, from altered landscapes and erected buildings to cities to industrial and post-industrial hyper-exosomatization. So surroundings are constituted by temporality and as temporality, not just in terms of becoming, that is to say the past, but also futurity, as in perpetually transforming relation to past and present, a memory of the future, as it were. This is the title of the other event. So first, the genetic memory, or the information expressed in DNA, passed down vertically by filiation from parents to offspring. Second, epigenetic memory, or the kind acquired epigenetically through a complex nervous system. So neither vertical nor entirely horizontal, sort of between the innate and acquired. The good example, I think, is a spoken language. You are born into it, it pre-exists you, and you get coerced into using it properly. Finally, the whole sausage, the enchilada, epi-phylo-genetic memory, or the sedimented epigenetic differentiations within the spatio-temporal organization of material environments or surroundings. This is a past that has not been lived, capable of fashioning collective expectations or pretension in Husserlian language. This mnemotechnology is not inherited by vertical filiation, obviously, but acquired through horizontal alliances. The third memory, as Leroy Goran used to call it, consists in the organization of the inorganic matter, including writing, art, clothing, tools, machines, but also filmmaking, and especially architecture, given its because of its long durée. So the next entry to our glossary is surroundings, that with which we surround ourselves. That is that which we actively adopt with an O, rather than passively adapt to with an A. Arguably, complexity is not determined by the presence or absence of memory, but by the degree of memory's detachment from the quote-unquote body proper. This is a Ruyerian point. So to repeat, the animate has always been utterly, in this sense, dependent on the inanimate or epigenetic. Detaching memory from the organic changes the condition for further phylogenetic becomings, given that evolutions continue to get organized by associated technicized milieus or surroundings. This is a Simondonian trope. In such a view, technics is not the opposite of life, but its evolution, a continuation of life by means other than life. This is a famous Stieglerian ritornello, a non-organic life, to use the title of essay by De Landa from Incorporations. I know I'm going too fast, but please bear with me. So the next entry is transindividuation. Stiegler makes a big deal out of this Simondonian concept in terms of its ethico-political ramifications. According to the two compatriots, Simondon and Stiegler, knowledge is not simply cognitive, so to speak, but presupposes the formation of social circuits of transindividuation through which a form of knowledge is constituted. Transindividuation is in fact only made possible by tertiary retentions, constituted by what Stiegler calls artificial organs, that is to say technics and mnemotechnics or technicities in Simondonian vocabulary. So these exo-organs are thus instrumental in linking psychic individuations and collective individuations. And unsurprisingly, this is also very close to Guattari's three ecologies. So the environmental, mental, and the collective ecology, the socius itself. The noetic brain has always been constituted through its relation to a memory that is dead, inorganic. This is organologically spatialized temporal expression. In the words of a fellow Gibsonian, William Mace, ask not what is inside your head, but what your head is inside of. However, the inorganic memory has not replaced the noesis of the living brain. The transgenerational articulation of singularities by way of linking psychic individual brains, epiphylo-genetically, as we said, constitutes a radical auto-affective circuit between the dead and living memory. I need Stavros to tell me hypomnesis and anamnesis, or
hypomnesis and anamnesis. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, but we can, yeah.
You'll get there. In other words, neganthropogenesis is quasi-causal, neo-finalist, and teleodynamic, to use three kindred anti-mechanicist concepts by Deleuze, Rouillet, and Gökhan, respectively. Allure of the virtual, in Didier the basis, as he calls it. And by the way, Terence Gökhan is a contemporary neuroanthropologist, the author of a wonderful book. The title is Incomplete Nature, How Mind Emerges from Matter. We will get to the neganthropogenesis shortly, as we now switch from the early technics and time, Stiegler, to the late what's wrong with the Anthropocene, Stiegler. And the tradition, I might as well add, is not as abrupt as some commentators make it seem. But before we do, let us touch on architecture or the built environment. Supposedly, this is our core expertise. So the question, what might be the difference between the architect and the bee? In order to answer the question, we have to refer to grammatization, defined as a process of analytical formalization, discretization, reproduction, and automation. According to Stiegler, the question of grammatization in relation to the architect and the bee had appeared already in Marx's Grundrisse under exteriorization of knowledge into automatons and machines, but was conspicuously and fatally, according to him, absent from Das Kapital 10 years later. It is precisely because the knowledge of humans is outside their body that they are noetic, that is to say, capable of thinking, conceiving, and realizing what they conceive. Thanks to this capacity for abstraction on the basis of epi-phylo-genetic memory, architects may conceive what they will eventually build. Whereas bees, the animals, merely realize a structural coupling with their environment in the Maturana and Varela sense that passes through an adjustment which is purely genetic and not epigenetic. According to Stiegler, the noetic impression does not remain trapped within the endosomatic circuit between the receptors and effectors that are sensory motor organs of every living thing, including the bee and the architect. So it doesn't remain trapped, but it gives an expression which is exteriorized via fabricated objects or artifacts, of which all trans-individual expressions are but layers. And it is only noetic on this very condition of exterioration. So exosomatization is the condition of noesis, of thought, of knowledge of every kind, how to live, how to make, or how to think, conceptual or spiritual knowledge. So now late Stiegler, 5 entries: entropy, negentropy, entropy, negantropy, and instead of the Anthropocene, neganthropocene. So very briefly, it is imperative to rethink entropy and negentropy in terms that are related to, but different from, the attempted formalizations by the hard sciences and information sciences as well. The anthropo-genetic process is thermodynamic on the physical plane, that is to say entropic, to do with the heat death, and it is negentropic on the biological plane. This is, Stiegler takes this from Schrodinger's essay on, from 1945, What is Life? And mind you, this is a theory of life and not a theory of information. We have to bear this in mind. So in the strict sense, negative entropy would mean going back in time, because only then would entropy be reversible. So it's better to see it more as a local limitation or a temporary deferral of the entropic tendency. So the individuation or anthropogenesis, the process is both anthropic, that is to say, with the homogenizing tendency, stabilizing, but it is also neganthropic or exosomatic in Alfred Lotka's terms. Inspired by Levi-Strauss, who thought that anthropology should be spelled as anthropology with an E, Stiegler coins the term Anthropocene instead of Anthropocene. Given the unsustainability of the Anthropocene due to its incredible increase of entropy, Stiegler advocates the adoption of neg entropy as the criterion of every type of value, the value of value, as it were, hence the neg Anthropocene, capable, according to him, of producing collective intelligence, as opposed to entropy, which he equates directly with stupidity and disindividuation. So entanglement of the inorganic yet organized and the organic yet exosomatic becomes the static, economic, technological, scientific, and philosophical question par excellence. To conclude, noetic psychic individuation, that is to say thinking, is conditioned by technical individuation, but not determined by it. The epi-phylo-genetic memory opens up a field of unlimited possibilities, but for better or for worse. It is a pharmacon, Stiegler insists, a poison that can become a remedy, or vice versa. Very close to Guattari's chaosmosis he takes from Joyce, which is both, as we know, a friend and an enemy, chaos and cosmos together, producing both entropy as it were and negentropy. So our existential milieu is thus metastable, insofar as epiphylogenesis continuously rearranges the enabling constraints and does so by quote-unquote unnatural couplings or alliances that escape both vitalism and mechanicism. So neither ghost nor machine. To paraphrase Marshall McLuhan, and I end this, I will end with this line: ecology starts where nature ends. So I have to say apologies to those who have made the time to send in their questions. We have to say we have received a number of pertinent questions and statements, too many to grant the space that they would actually deserve. So given the format of this webinar, we took the liberty of kind of reducing them to 5 meta questions. So one would be the question of time and collectivity. Another one would hypomnesis.
Hypomnesis, yes.
Trans-individuation. The third one, the digital, and proletarianization. Another one that I have difficulties with. So with this, I conclude that the very first part, I think it was below 15 minutes. Open it up immediately. Maybe first to questions of disambiguation, and then perhaps we go to the questions, the actual questions themselves. We've got them here on the screen. So. And this is my favorite slide because I think it's funny because it's true.
So who is going to break the ice? No one's going to break the ice. So it was all super clear what Andrej just went through, right? Yeah. For me, that's exactly the problem I have with Stiegler. It's not a problem I have with Andrej. Andrej just makes it even worse, as we were discussing the other day. The problem I have with Stiegler, and I was telling Andrej yesterday, is that he's using way too many terms to speak about more or less similar things, which are in their core value, they're quite simple stuff also. So he's using, but also that's what makes him a good philosopher as well, on the other hand. I mean, similar to what Deleuze and Guattari might be doing 30, 40 years ago, speaking with different concepts about similar issues, because they've been using many different concepts referring back to the same issue. The same way Stiegler, I think many of his concepts like grammatization, exosomatization, all the different, let's say, categories of memory in there. Many of these concepts refer more or less to the same thing. And if I were to follow the lead of Mark Hansen, who has written even more lately about Stiegler extensively, I would say that Stiegler could be understood as a very basic, let's say, on its very basic ground, as a philosopher first of desire. So he's trying to understand how desire is produced, how desire is channeled, and how desire is expressed also in whatever, let's say, whatever consequences this might stand for. And I think it has various consequences, not only for him, but for all of us. And secondly, and that has not been written openly and plainly, but I would like to propose it. The second, let's say, category that we could place Stiegler in is as a philosopher of power, but a philosopher of power that has not to do with, I mean, Patrick can expand much more on that because he's actually a proper philosopher. Power, understood in its Latin etymology, is both potestas and potentia. Okay. Most philosophers of power, and I would put even Foucault in there, most philosophers of power have focused on the second aspect, on the potentia. Stiegler is saying that actually we might benefit more if we start focusing and prioritizing even the first one, potestas. Meaning all the technological individuals, all the technological objects that determine who we are, how we are produced, and eventually how we desire what we desire. Now that he puts all the salt and pepper of 10,000 different terms, okay, it's to his benefit and to our own trouble.
It's also, I don't know. Yeah, I'm just wondering about in our discussion whether we should keep away from trying to work out how his notion of phylum is different to that of, let's say, Deleuze and Guattari, and secondly, what the consequences that has for the notion of an abstract machine. I mean, if you enter in the question now of power as potestas, as opposed to capacity or the ability for something to realize itself as effect, then it seems to me that what I would find very interesting is how he situates. I mean, it's something I tried to work on in an essay 15 years ago. Where is he different in his question concerning the technological in terms of the historical? How does temporality in that sense?
It's one of the questions we're going to put is precisely about temporality, but I wouldn't like to run to it. I think it's the first one.
Okay, yeah. No, it's just that I'm wondering about phylum and abstract machine. Would that be a good place to begin?
Mm-hmm. I would say yes. Just a disclaimer, since this is more like a round table, everyone can intervene. So don't hesitate to say what you're thinking about it. No, people, you are hesitating. Okay. So let's go to the first question, which is connected with what Patrick is saying, and also could be understood under the. I mean, I haven't planned that. We haven't planned that, but I think indeed a discussion on phylum or phylums or phyla, let's say, could be beneficial for this first question. Do we read the question or we read it silently, or shall we read it together, Andre?
Let's read it. Let's read it. But I've spoken too long, so somebody else should pick it up.
Okay, the first question goes: how does technology, in the way that it's exteriorized, in the way that actually it's exteriorizing memory, which now that I read it, I think that also this should be explained further. So how does technology, in its exteriorization of memory, and Stiegler is calling that tertiary retention, produces the notion of time, and how, therefore, later on, technology in exteriorizing also intentionality, tertiary protension in Stiegler's term, produces collectives as well. I mean, what Andrej was saying, genetic, epigenetic, epiphylo-genetic, these three different types of memory, Stiegler is classifying them as primary, secondary, and tertiary, retentions and protensions. Retentions, you can take them literally as memories. Protensions, you can take them as intentions. A very simple example of technology in the way that Stiegler understands it is, I mean, a piece of paper. Let me leave down my smoking device. A piece of paper, a pen that you write stuff on. This thing belongs to tertiary retentions and protensions in the sense that I can give that later on to somebody else that has not been in the room with me. That person can read, literally can read and can come in touch with my own memories, okay? But besides having necessarily any kind of immediate contact with me or any kind of temporal contact with me. So we can get together both in my past, but also we can get together both in our intentionality, because I might just be putting some ideas in his mind right now. I might just be forming his intentions or his desires right now. Stiegler's basic claim is that the way we remember and the way we desire collectively, because it's always collective, is always technological. Technology comes first in there. Technology not as computers again and screens. Technology as anything that we do in order to manipulate our environment and intervene in it. Because this writing on a paper is an intervention in an environment.
I was just going to.
That was a question. Yeah.
Stavros, I was just going to mention referring back to the bee versus architect moment. So the bee cannot recount, I mean, an encounter with another bee who happened to see something precisely because there is no tertiary retention there. It cannot, as it were, say, I've just seen another bee and it told me that there is a beautiful lawn 5 miles from here, because because it's kind of locked in this what did I call it?
The bee and any bee have
an endosomatic, it's endosomatic capture in one sense, but I mean, that's where the epigenetic seems to be so important. What is the difference between, say, our DNA that is coded, the necessity that's supposed to come from our genetics, and what we could do about it, like dieting or exercise, or in some sense, the Stoics felt that that the question of the variety of life was what was the life of life itself, and it was everything at the end. It was all about the fire and the mind, the heat of the mind itself. It is the possibility of the constant change. That's the logos spermaticon, I think, in the Stoic sense. But here, your example of the bee is a really complex example, because it's the notion of capture, which
starts supposedly millions of years ago with the Flintstones.
Yes, but I mean, homing pigeons seem to be able to learn if the place they are meant to has been changed. They seem to be able to recognize that, and so there is some kind of epigenetic information going on, which is shaping behavior, and therefore we would imagine it as being quite thoughtful.
But not epiphylogenetic, because it's
not epiphylo. That's why I think this question of the phylum and the abstract machine, it would be very interesting to work out how Stiegler, even if Stavros complains about the multiplication of his nominations and conceptual terms, how does he relate to those terms of the abstract machine and the phylum in the late work of Guattari and Deleuze? And I'm just wondering if any of the participants particularly would have something to say about that, because I think it's really, in an essay I wrote 15 years ago, I tried to ask what Stiegler's relationship was to the question of Heidegger and techne, and secondly, Deleuze, but I didn't really get to the point of how this question of memory and technology and storage and forms actually exist in his work, because I didn't know enough of it.
Would you ask, Patrick, do you ask this question as a question on evolution? Let's say, so how can we speak via Stiegler about evolution, or how can we speak via Stiegler about the classification and taxonomization?
Well, it's more, for me, it's in a trivial sense, it's the opening question, because are the collectivities gathered together? I mean, does the person take that piece of paper from you because they already want something within that information? I mean, your example of the taking of the paper, following on your description of a pipe as your device for something, is quite interesting, because the pipe, your pipe is not a pipe, it's a device. Secondly, the piece of paper is already culturally so deeply inscribed that the memory projects that are there are already multiple. And thirdly, the desire for anybody to participate in your memories or to be shaped by and to shape also must have some kind of code. So in other words, the abstract machine itself, just with the phylum as this massive, unshapedness, if I may say that, that is just working away. I mean, that's where my question comes from.
But I think that I'm going to overuse my role as host, and I'm going to take advantage of it, and I don't want to do that. So I would like somebody else to chip in into the discussion. Marc, Robert, do you want to? Renske, all the people I see in front of me, Heidi.
Well, I was interested in just the epi for a moment, the epigenetics. As I told you, I was quite into the let's say the overflow of the metaphorical in the physical typology of evolution lately. And so, as we all know, that this metaphorical hill in which this evolutionary shape gets its dimensions can be, let's say, altered dramatically by some sort of a traumatic event to shift this ball from one hillock to the other. But then, of course, now more in the context of what we're talking about, it is interesting to think about the reversal of this, let's say, evolutionary process. If you now look at the research of the embryonic stem cells, for instance, in which you can actually reverse its biological evolution to get it back up the hill, so to speak, to be shaped again into a different format or a different outcome. And then connect this to this, let's say, this exo memory, this collective memory, if you want, this piece of paper, what you have would have left in a different stage of your evolution, then you cannot speak of forgetting, but then you can only speak of unknowing. But what is then the difference between your own unknowledge at that point in the evolution and the knowledge that you have gained in a further stage of evolution? And how does this relate to the very notion of time, as you have stated here? Because what is then time? How is it expressed? Is it just a chronological event or an eventing, or is this is it measured in events, or is it measured in some sort of chronological unfolding? And I think that is quite interesting to put it also in the context to intentionality, because what could this be then, seen from that perspective of a pushing back of the hill, so to speak? So maybe I just confused the confusion, but this was my secondary approach to the same question.
But I think, no, but I'm not going to do what I said I was not going to do. So somebody
Stavros, please tell us how it's done.
No, I mean, okay, if I may abuse my role again, and before interrupting Andrej, I think it's interesting to understand Stiegler's approach to time as something that he doesn't clearly mention, but I think it's quite heavily influenced by Bergson's understanding of time. In the sense of, as what you are describing, more close to something that is an eventive, let's say, eventuating understanding of time, rather than a chronological one. What Stiegler is doing, and he's not openly, let's say, claiming so, it's mostly my interpretation now, what Stiegler is doing in the famous cone of Bergson, the inverted cone, which actually is his way, Bergson's way of expressing that time is not about the past, present, and future, but it's rather about the virtual and the actual. So what is happening and what could have happened, and how this what could is already condensed in each one of us in the form of our memory. That's why he even calls it, let's say, that memory that could be a memory of the future even, because it's a memory of the what could. I think what Stiegler is doing there is this condensing moment, this tip of the cone. He's saying it's not anthropic, it's not human, it's rather fully on artificial and technological, meaning that this opening to the virtual is not done by a humanist default, essentially speaking, it's produced technologically.
If I can just step in. I see that Robert has also unmuted himself, but just one sentence I think that connects some of the things that we've been talking about. He was on record that Stiegler says that entropy has been ignored literally by the whole tradition, the Greeks, for certain, Heidegger himself, but also contemporary philosophers, except for Bergson. So Bergson, he says, is the only one who understood it, and I think you made already your point. And he says, and apart from him, also Freud, in his Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which brings us back to your initial statement about drives and all of that. But I think I'm looking at Robert. You unmuted yourself. You clearly wanted to say something. I don't want to play.
I was thinking about, let's say, maybe how to bring this into what Patrick was saying about, let's say, the phylum, and why the phylum is central in his conception, I think. And I'll probably be super reductive in my interpretation about it, but I always thought that epi-phylo-genetic in some sense always implies epi is, let's say, the environmental aspect. The phylum is, as you already imply, the question where there's a certain grouping happening, whereas, let's say, the epigenetic is, of course, related to a process of differentiation. So there is a differentiation that then leads to a certain grouping where this twofold dynamic creates some sort of genesis, some sort of evolution that is created by this, what Simondon will call integration differentiation. No? So like this twofold process. And technology in this exteriorization, I, in a sense, always read that phyletic notion then technically. And maybe to break the all-male discussion, I want to bring in Karan Bharat here, because I think that could be interesting to understand that as a kind of an extension of, let's say, the idea of apparatus, because I know for that, let's say, from the Bergsonian perspective in quantum physics right now, there's an increasing awareness of how actually time only emerges from the co-constitutive interaction of parts, that only like as complex ensembles create a sense of stillness and time. So it's actually a very ethological understanding that emerges there. So I think actually it's both at the same time. That's very interesting. It explains how something like chronos, like that form of time as, like, you know, this kind of background motion emerges, but also how certain phase shifts could emerge. So like this, like, and I think that there's a certain shift in Stiegler's thinking from, let's say, first of all, how is this connected to, let's say, some sort of evolution? But then how is this also related to some sort of classification that we can use? And I think what Stavros is hinting at there, and I think that's the like super interesting thing, is that it's an evolution that proceeds by not only opening up to the future, but also selecting for something narrowed down. And it's only by narrowing down as an enabling constraint, as this kind of technical setup is, certain phenomena emerge, certain collectives emerge. Our brain's idea of the passing of time emerges, and so on and so on. So I think it's actually like this kind of, just not only that, let's say, the tripartition in the concept is structured precisely around Guattari's three ecologies, no, environmental, social, and mental, in the term of the genesis of the individuation there. But it is also that there's, in my reading, that then the exteriorization that is central to it, how these things are organized into parts with a certain relation, that then both memories, pasts are formed, but also that certain trajectories are set.
It seems to me, could I just comment there? Because otherwise one forgets almost immediately the point that strikes one. And that is also a point in Dr. Boumeester's issue. It seems to me that we might want to ask the question, does evolution evolve? Mm-hmm. In other words, if we're thinking of evolution always in a term of linear line, sort of, this is the whole problem of entropy, whether in what direction is the arrow of time, and we leave that aside, then our version of what is an evolutionary situation belongs to the event. And it seems to me that that event is where the folding unfolding of Deleuze is also very important, because the plane of immanence is established simply by what we don't know.
And it has to be built. It's not found.
And, no, it's not found. It's constructivist. The abstract machine is, even within our desires and moods and motions, has to do with what Heidi in one of her essays called the constant twist and untwisting of the constructivist paradigm itself. Because we find certain things, how do we say, more fitting for our well-being than others, although we don't quite know how to define the notion of well-being. I mean, in other words, how could the evolutionary, in the Darwinian sense, only have as its aim the need to survive, since most things don't survive? And we don't, of course.
If I can just pick up on what you said, because I think this is, for me, the most exciting moment when we realize, as you said, that it is about evolution, and maybe this is where Darwinian vector has to be complemented by the neo-Lamarckian idea, which is to say that we don't simply adapt to something that is already there, because that would mean that eventually we would adapt to such an extent that we would perfectly coincide with our milieu. I'm bringing it back to the surroundings.
And you'd be over. That would be it.
It's a black hole, what Guattari says. So the idea, and Stiegler very often refers to Canguilhem's idea of the infidelity of the milieu, infidelity.
Yes.
I think the infidelity is produced is something that is a matter of machinic phylum, something that draws us away from ourselves so as to produce a certain kind of crisis, the liminal situation, which forces us to now readjust. And that's basically, I'm describing this loop so it is an attempt not to occupy the preset already given niche, but to surround ourselves with the surroundings, so as to indeed catalyze the very infidelity of the milieu in order to provoke ourselves into thinking, because thinking doesn't come naturally. It has to be forced upon us almost violently.
And what you are describing is what Stiegler is calling necanthropology.
Yes,
combination with
that is the neganthropic in a sense.
Is the infidelity, is the prolongation of an interval before coinciding absolutely with your environment.
Which is the opposite of entropy, which is equals stupidity.
That's a bold claim. Yeah.
I'm quoting him directly. For him, stupidity equals disindividuation. The fact that you cannot individuate, there is no movement there. You completely coincide with your surroundings.
You could even say that stupidity is more understood better if you claim it as idiocy in the old school way, where it comes from the Greek verb idiot, which means idiotis, which means the private citizen. So you're just focused on you, you know.
In other words, you're not connected, and you're not connected in the abstract machinic sense. You lose connection, and that seems to be the key disabling idea here. Then that you cannot exist in that sense without first of all understanding that whole phylum of matter and of disorganizing of the chaos, and then the cosmos is you're bringing that. This is a kind of it's not dialectical in a Hegelian sense. It's actually how things eventuate through prosthesis, through virtual projects and so on. So I think that's where the idea of time, and Robert's quite right about Stavros on that Bergson obviously is trying to challenge Spencer's idea of evolution. I mean, he's very influenced by Spencer as a young man in the École Normale Supérieure, which he abandons because of meeting with Lucretian or with, say, Stoic physics. And that's worth knowing more about, actually.
But this question of time is also a question of acceleration. As I was saying, there's the simple X organisms, as Robert was talking about, then complex ones, which is civilizations, empires, kingdoms, and then the industrial and post-industrial moment, and it seems as if it's accelerating in a way.
Oh, we're just recognizing the machinic more. I mean, you know, the discussions about the mechanical. I mean, you can trace them, of course, to the 17th century very directly, but perhaps we're only catching up with what actually, you know, our world is.
But if I may bring Heidi into the discussion, just now to interrupt here from.
I tried to by mentioning her essay
now I'll bring
on Mexican on dogs, but she didn't say a word.
I will lure her in because I saw both Andrej and there a bit after Andrej. I also watched the lectures he gave some days ago on theory, architecture theory, but let's say theory for the sake of the discussion as an augmentative practice. Mm-hmm. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Am I saying correctly the title, right? Yeah. How would you, now I'm provoking you, in the light of the discussion we're having now, how could you speak of an augmentative practice? What would be considered augmentation?
Well, that's really putting me on the spot because next to these really brainy talks, mine is obviously dumbed down for the MSc1 group.
Yeah, no, it was. I don't think it was dumped, but okay.
Dumbed down, I mean, a bit. But yeah, it's actually one of the notes that I've been following here. Very much something you said early on. You also mentioned that to students earlier this semester on the potestas and potencia, right?
Yeah.
So obviously the augmentative comes from Massumi, so the idea of Brian Massumi, in the sense of potencia. So it's more on the productivist aspect of it, on augmenting it, so more in the inventive side of it. If I'm following correctly on the discussion right now, that puts all that on their head. So augmentative more in the intentionality. So more towards the intentional rather than the directional. So I'm not really sure. I probably cannot even, I can't even link the ideas together into a coherent sentence. But it's putting my comfort zone on the spot, right?
I'm asking it on purpose because there is a connection with what Patrick was just referring as. I mean, Patrick was referring to a very basic Stiglerian understanding, which is the one of prosthesis, you know, of prosthetic, then whatever comes afterwards, prosthetic something. That, I mean, augmentative and prosthetic could be understood as slightly close to each other.
I would call it in the type of kinship, yes. Yet I had not thought about it in those terms, and I think Brian Massumi is not referring to it in that sense.
No.
So yeah, I take it from him in that particular lecture. But I've been thinking a lot about that aspect of technicity. So really how to bring that further into the potestas rather. Okay.
Because
you really put in the spot. I was not ready. I'm just, you know, basting in the discussion here, but I was not ready to answer that. But yeah.
As Andrej knows, I mean, we've been discussing about whether the concept of prosthesis or prosthetics in Stiegler, whether it's something that should be taken face value and acknowledged as something positive or actually as a negative moment in Stiegler. Negative in the sense of, yeah.
I think a lot of the, just to go back to a linguistic, if I may, you know, epi could also be peri. I mean, there's no reason that this prepositional usage has to be understood. Like if we said something is epiphenomenal, then we could say, for example, a museum is epiphenomenal of artistic practice. It doesn't necessarily mean that we get any closer to the phenomenon. But if we leave aside the sort of prepositional, the deep grammar of what traps us, we might get still to the question of the prosthesis. And the thesis part of that is interesting, of the stasis of the pro. Is it a kind of a way of setting upon? And of course, any of you who are aware of my interest in this know immediately I'm trying to get to the Gestell, trying to get to the Heideggerian way in which the technological is said to set upon physis, or the coming into being, or the emergent. And this is the parallel notion of capture, but this capture is of course different than the genetic capture, such as you get in the behavior of the bee. This is where the epigenetic really starts to show itself, because it belongs to the temporalizations that are constitutive of, or have been in some essentialist way constitutive through this usage of potentia, because there's an essence that has a potential for something, and that's a traditional view of the evolutionary. So I think in there somewhere we have a chance of unpacking, of destructuring the intensities of structuring that Stiegler already accepts. And it's there in those cracks and fissures we might begin to see how our other questions come up, because there is another four. There are another four.
Yeah, we'll go there. Yeah.
I mean, I would like if we went through the questions each, then try and come back at the end to see what way the questions have, brought more questions, or do we have a better sense of what?
Yes, that would be also my proposal, because I also know that we collected a few of the notions that were brought up by the rest of the group.
Participants,
so to invite them also to recognize some of their work already, and then maybe reflect on this openly here.
Yeah.
So let's go to number 2 then.
Maybe
Thinking about this, the machinic phylum, and I'm sorry in advance, but I will now also play Stavros' card and put somebody on the spot. I have recently had the pleasure of reading Rike's latest essay on the I see it in terms of exosomatization. The idea is, how is it that now drones are being utilized in architecture planning, which of course immediately makes you think about this new capacity that is not meant to be, but now it's there, and it re-singularizes our psyche by way of producing a machinic phylum, a new possibility, as it were, which now, once it's there, it draws us away from our ourselves, and provides for literally a new, like not to use the term, provides for another sensorium, exosomatic sensorium. So I was going to ask Rike, am I forcefully making this connection, or you see it in terms of could it be seen in terms of epi-phylo-genetic kind of movement? The fact that now we have something that literally kind of we throw it out there, and we have a capacity. It's not just simple map making. It's not that kind of abstraction. It's literally like this, pulling ourselves out of ourselves, so to grow a tentacle which allows us to design things differently, or think differently, for that matter.
Well, thank you for bringing it into the discussion, Andrej. Well, the way I see it is that it somehow extends our body and extend a possibility to experience, but also sense in a completely new way. And I think I was somehow been provocated by the idea that the prosthesis somehow disconnects you from the world, makes you distant, not in contact anymore. And I somehow just had the idea that, and that's maybe linked to knowledge from film work, that there was something at stake due to sensorial aspects that I was very keen on trying to get a better grip on. So that was the starting point. I do see it as a prosthesis that is an extension, but it's how to say it? I mean, it's really, really important that it's not that it's just because now you can do something else with your body. The extension is really much, maybe not only as an extority, but actually as an intority. The fact that you start to perceive, you start to explore, you start to feel differently.
And the link to Masumi is also something that I have tried to bring in, this whole idea of immediation, the whole idea of effect that happens in this interchange as a key aspect. I also have had the experience that it has almost been forbidden somehow to talk about feelings, and then it becomes something about a subject. But I would probably also argue that the understanding of subject is also somehow really being changed due to these issues. Because what is the subject anymore? Is it me? Is it the drone? Is it the drone me, the thing that I become while using it? And I think the use is really important. And what is the landscape in my case becoming due to this interchange? Or you could call it a new type of ecology if you want. So yeah, I don't know whether that somehow opens up into that issue.
Would you be so kind to type the title of the thing in the chat, so for people who might want to follow it up?
Yeah,
that would be great. Because I'm thinking in terms of this is not different. It's different in degree, not in kind. From let's say this is another subject that's very dear to both Stiegler but also to Patrick. I know the cave paintings. I mean, because the brain structure that of contemporary person and somebody from 20 to 30,000 years ago is exactly the same. What is different is how it's wired, and it's wired upon the influence of what these people were exposed to. So there is a moment, like the moment that I referred to, like 2-3 million years ago with the Flintstone tools, but then the great moment where, in terms of trans-individuation, the fact that somebody could actually leave a trace of a painting on in the cave for other people who might not yet been born by the time this was at the time this was drawn. So it immediately provides for the capacity to trans-individuate. So the tertiary retention is really crucial, as I was trying to point out, in terms of noesis. How is it that they think, and how is it that the psyche is connected by way of tertiary retention, so as to produce the collective psyche, and ultimately, you know, we arrive at this point of trans individuation. And of course, this is highly challenged now with the latest.
But it's nice that you mentioned the cave painting, because also initially we're thinking also of connecting a bit the topic of today's let's say webinar to cinema as well, right? I mean, that was one of our initial plans. It never really went through 100%, so cinema might appear here and there. It's also, I mean, Stiegler also uses the cinematic as a very important concept in his latest, let's say latest, I mean, after the 2000 now on, the last 20 years. But I mean, if I may provoke something from anyone to react, how could one ever understand cave paintings as something prosthetic?
Well,
I mean, what were we lacking, and cave painting came to fulfill? That's my main problem with Stiegler. The aspect of prosthesis, I'm saying it openly, it's my main problem with Stiegler. And the small asterisk, there is a funny discursive, let's say, beef, a funny discursive opposition between orthodox Simondonians and orthodox Stieglerians, precisely on that point, on the point of processes.
Could I just mention, first of all, like if we were very specific, Leroy Gökhan, much of his academic work at Musée de l'Homme, etc., was actually about Paleolithic art.
Yeah.
So it's very central in a way to a whole discussion that started to emerge about techniques and our society. I think for us, as in our period, we accept quite easily a point made by Deleuze, I think at one stage, who says that, you know, in Cézanne's landscapes, there is a de-anthropomorphizing. In other words, the capacity of viewing overtakes seeing or showing. In other words, in that sense, it dephenomenologizes the idea of just seeing as some intentional act that you can give a kind of description of. So you have rather a view, and it's a more geometrico in Cézanne, that the looking is actually there as geometry, as the tupos, or the type, or the shapes, the schemata, which are available in the world. And that those forms or types or schemata return and return and return. So that the cave paintings, for example, the usage of the red ochre, the fact that they are in dark spaces that are very difficult of access. We don't quite know, are they attached to magical, religious, or ritual practice? Were they part of the magic of the hunt? Did you enable the hunting by these figurations, which were apparently collective actions, because we see a lot of children's hands in the famous cave in Bourges, where you have all the hands. There are adolescents and children as well as adults there. So it's a very rich and complex area. But I would say, just to help with the discussion, if I may, that if it is the case that the prosthesis of using ochre, how to fix it, using blowpipes to blow it on the wall, or what way this was done, changes, in other words, the epigenetic here changes the genetic. It has more potestas than the potentia of the genetic itself. And this is where the evolutionary lacks this dynamic idea of where the human actions or the actions themselves can create our consciousness.
No, my provocation for discussion, and I think more people should also open up to the discussion, is that, if I quote Stiegler directly from the Fault of Epimetheus, okay, in Technics and Time. He's saying that technology should be understood as a prosthetic replacement that manages to supplement the primordial deficits of human beings.
Yes.
And I'm just saying, naively, and Heidi wants to comment on that. And naively, I'm just saying, what primordial deficit do we have that cave painting is covering? I'm actually saying that it should be the other way around. We're not aware of any deficit until we paint it on the wall.
No, because the cave, if we look at Lascaux, Max Raphael in his famous book on cave painting wants to say we can interpret this as historical societies with totem animals which are in conflict. It's societies which change that are historical. It is not societies that remain stagnant. So it does go back to this idea that the instrumentarium itself is the procedure and process for time, not the other way around. So that would help. In other words, language shaped our ability to think. Painting shaped our ability to see. So actions we're involved in, or so on and so forth, have a power that we don't fully grasp.
Yeah. Heidi, now it's your time.
Well, it's kind of washed out here. It's just a matter of understanding, for instance, the augmentative as enhancement rather than a replacement or an extension of. It's an enhancement, and I think that is where the crux is.
To continue the provocation, I promise it's going to be the last time. I would say that Stiegler ended up to Simondon and Buran by starting initially with Derrida, and that's not a secret. He started via Derrida and ended up there. I think that might explain something about his understanding, which focuses on mostly a negative to be replaced or a deficit to be covered, let's say, approach to technology. What Simondonians like Muriel Comte, for example, Muriel Comte was working on Simondon. She was working on him much before Simondon became popular again lately, even before Stiegler himself. What Comte is suggesting to Stiegler, and they never have that discussion actually picked up, unfortunately, since Stiegler is no longer with us. What Comte is suggesting to Stiegler is, what if we understood technology not as replacing a deficit, but as rather something that we tune in with our own affective, let's say, gradients, and it helps us either amplify them or diminish them, our affects, what we can do. So it's not about neither adding something somewhere, nor extracting something from somewhere. It's about amplifying our power or diminishing our power. But this power is contingent, is not given in advance. There's no archetypical human that lacks things.
Yeah.
I couldn't have said it better.
I think that is indeed the question there. Yeah. But if we go to the cave paintings, and and I will always happily do so. Whether or not they're art is still a question we can't answer. I mean, if they are actual instruments used for magical religious ritual, then they are instrumental. There is a kind of an efficient causality, even via magical thinking. There is still some idea that for example, you know, the famous image of the figure falling backwards, who is in a state of erection in front of an auroch, which has its intestines falling out of it, seems to be a shamanic figure. And it seems to me that a lot of historians of religion, like sort of Walter Burkert for Greek religion, or Eliade and others, continuously go back to this shaman figure as a fundamental hypo-medicinal, magical religious figure. And we would have to understand that, if we could, to arrive at understanding how these images work, either in terms of hallucination or in terms of representation, making present again, in order to empower activity. And that goes to the Stavros point, I think, at the end there, that empowering of the activity may come from both directions.
I saw Robert, let's say, struggling intensively with something in his brain, probably. Do you want to add something, Robert, or not? Or will I mistake it?
I had an idea. I'm unmuted. No, yeah. I had an idea to, I don't know, because let's say the way what Stavros was saying before, I'm not, let's say, in the early work, of course, you still see that Derridarian trajectory, and of course, how it's very clearly tied to this kind of negative approach, you know, so like this deconstructive, and it leads them to this kind of negative approach. But I think then the point is that he turns that into kind of a productive understanding that reclaims something, you know, in terms of this kind of neganthropic work, the neganthropocene, like this kind of selection that happens, and in order to explain that, no. And I think to bring that back to the question of hypognesis, then I think what could be interesting is Stiegler not actually, or is what he's trying to hint at is actually that it's not reducing potentials, and it's not even a theory that is founded on a primordial lack or so, but that it is actually understood when you say he's a philosopher of desire. Is it not actually something that then as a constellation changes desiring production? And it changes it by reducing spaces of possibilities. And it's this reduction, for example, this cave painting, that draws a certain group together, that consolidates it, that consolidates differences in this group. And therefore it has a kind of individuating effect. Social roles are more strongly counter-differentiated and reciprocally determined for another. So they produce a kind of assemblage through this technical object, which is this cave painting. No?
But maybe a better example of that is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, where you have these kind of enormous lithic, T-shaped lithic structures, and they seem to have been put in place before the development of surplus economy through agriculture. And so, like Stonehenge, is it there? Does it create the assembly, or do people assemble to create it? I mean, there is a kind of chicken-egg problem with all of this all the time. The answer must be it goes in both ways.
What I find interesting is maybe because in, I'm not sure, like I don't have the complete overview, but at least in Critique of Political Economy, Stiegler clearly links the notion of hypomnemata to this idea of sublimation. And like this entire question that you also said with what is not, that's how exteriorization is not part of capital. And of course it's Veräußerung. So Veräußerung and exteriorization then in the German conception always implies some sense of bailing out, giving away, for impoverishment. So like this idea of how exteriorization is narrowing down. I think that is not super clear, let's say, I think to me. It's like how these kind of things are related, but because you ask here, what is the role of the surroundings? And it's like in the moment that you surround yourself, they serve as an enabling constraint. No, but I'm not sure about this.
But that goes back to Andrej's earlier in towards the first question, what is milieu? I mean, the French can talk about a mental space. I mean, in English, this is all very difficult. And milieu, you can have an intellectual milieu. This has been constituted as we all speak here, but we are also now in lockdown, and so we have no touch. So suddenly all kinds of very minor things that we take for granted become we suddenly see are very, very important. People start losing their memory because they're spending too much time indoors all day. And I have friends of my age who are now beginning to think instantly, oh, we have Alzheimer's because we can't even remember what we had for breakfast. It's actually because it's the lack of variation that is creating the destruction of the memory. And it's also that much of what is humanly constitutive is what we just do all the time, meeting people, seeing people, buildings, whatever. So I think in some ordinary sense, part of this hypnomnesia that Stiegler is talking about belongs, in fact, to that everydayness.
And I think it's really good that Andrej brought that question there, which is the role of architecture in trans-individuation. Andrej, would you like to embark on this or not?
The architecture.
Why not?
Yeah. Yes. Where to start? I'm just. Let me see if I can. To me, I mean, it really is a question of trans-individuation ultimately. And I know I said a little bit about it. It's a mostly Simondonian issue, but I think this question is crucial in the sense that you remember. I'm trying to remember Gökhan or somebody who said. And it's related to what Robert said in terms of exomatization, exteriorization. This idea that we can point to the 5 digits, and these 5 digits can be transposed or transcribed as a code, as a number on a sheet of paper, and this can be passed on. And now beyond the biological finitude, I think this, for me, this is where it becomes incredibly interesting, because it means that this is the Lamarckian moment of architecture. The fact that it's actually evolution by means other than it's evolution of life by means other than life. The fact that the living is utterly dependent on the non-living, the fact that it's completely contingent, the fact that we have decided to elevate the ground to make it into a desk, a table that then we can sit around it. All these things build upon each, build one on top of the other in a to use Deacon's term, in a ratcheting way. Once we get somewhere, there is no way of going back. We cannot go back, even if we wanted to. So purely, utterly contingent, yet constraining in a positive way. So I think, to me, when I came across this, I was blown away, because I could finally understand what is it that architecture does, and first of all, what it does is it's a project, and I've written about this. It offers a project of defatalization. So there is no fate, there is no finality. We have the capacity of auto-affection, and I think by making surroundings or milieus not by insisting on the infidelity that forces us into different, that forces upon us different enabling constraints or capacities to be affected in a different way. We inevitably contribute to this neo-Lamarckian idea that nothing is given, everything is produced, and there is still a possibility for us to stumble upon something that has not yet been tapped into. I'm very excited about it, but I want to bring it back and say, but that does not in any way mean that there is ever I don't see it in terms of prosthesis, as Stavros was trying to kind of bring that to the table, because we don't really know what is it that we are missing, and because anything that we do comes out of this anthropo-genetic movement that has no telos, but it does have, to use another term by Gökhan, it does have teleonomy. There is a tendency that can be intuited somehow. So there is not intended end, but by reshuffling our surroundings, we produce an effect that acts quasi-causally, that has the lure of the virtual. And I think, so it's an ongoing process where architects can actually, literally contribute to anthropogenesis in a very meaningful way, albeit like by proxy, because we don't. So we can contribute to the. I think I'm mumbling now, going into circles.
I'd like to bring Marc into the discussion. I also know that Renzo is in the audience, and Renzo also is into architecture and cinema, and Marc also is into architecture and cinema. And I remember, when was it? It was 2010 or 11 that Marc had us made us watch a movie, the Hiroshima Mon Amour, the Hiroshima My Love, many years ago, almost a decade ago. How could this movie, and I'm going to be, let's say, intentionally using very few words, I'm not going to expand on it. How could this movie be understood in what Andrej was just describing? In the sense, where is architecture starting and where is it stopping? Because also that movie was one movie that probably expressed what went on down there in a manner much more profound than any documentary or any written account of what went there.
Yeah. Well, as always, we have the element of time and understanding also evolving during this conversation. So basically, I was just getting ready to answer the second question. So we're now already at the third. So, so I have to bring a little bit of the reflections of the second question also into this one, but actually it fits well. Because I was wondering why we treat, let's say, these different types of memory on an equal footing. We speak of externalized memory or internalized or living, vivid biological memory, as if it was based on the same principles. And maybe we are not talking about, let's say, its technical aspects of that in the technical sense of the word technical. But if you look at the pure nature of how this memory is stored, then you could always say that, or claim at least that this externalized memory is already cinematic by its nature. It is always an abstract, it's always a shortened form of whatever was evolving to lead to this knowledge or this insight which was memorized in the external way. Because we try to also include some sort of objectivism, pseudo-objective notion in this externalized memory, because it is also a part of this sharing, this collective. We need to find a communal language, and this is why we objectify this kind of thing, because if we would be completely subjective, we would use our own individual language. But this eventing time, which is already encapsulated in the externalized memory, in which shape or form, even architecture, you could claim it would appear, is for me highly cinematic in shape. And
that's beautiful. And I think it instantly, I was in Beijing and I saw that they referred to cinema, Marc, as electric shadows.
Oh, yeah, that's good. That's
this word shadow suddenly struck me. Why would you call cinema electric shadows? And my mind instantly went back to Giordano Bruno and one of his very earliest articles, De Ideas Umbras, on the ideas of the shadow, where he takes up a little passage of scripture from the Song of Songs, and Shulamit sat in the shadow of Solomon. He wants to draw the exegetical interpretation of that, meaning that we cannot know more than we know.
Mm-hmm.
The unknown is much greater than whatever can be known, which is part of the terror the past has for us. So that in these shadows, if you like, I think that the whole discussion about memory and science and knowledge starts right there in the Bruno article on memory. And I really think that this is something that for research would be very interesting when we begin to understand, that if I go to a darkened space and I see a film, how many different levels of illusion I'm accepting, and yet I, through all that illusion, have a new truth available to me when I have a real experience with film, that it can change your life in the way reading a book changes your life. Now, would we say that about going into a building? That seems to me to be an interesting question. The experience of space. And there we go to Andrej's idea of the milieu again, which is the milieu between spaces. And in that is the ambiguity where we find, like if we're in in the Hagia Sophia or in the Blue Mosque, and I've been in both, I had a very different experience of space, but I felt very different afterwards in the way changed by that experience. That seems to me to be an interesting question for architecture to talk about.
But I think what Stiegler, I mean, not so much in the first time he started referring to cinema in the cinematic time, in the third volume of the Technics and Time. Mostly also lately, I mean, we've read recently with Andrej, more or less in synchronization, the Neganthropocene book, where he starts focusing on something that he calls ArtEZ cinema. And there, I think it becomes even more clear that what he has in mind as cinema is something that it's even better if we understand it as affective. So technology in different levels, architecture, for example, on an initial level, Hiroshima Mon Amour or a movie, let's say, on another level. I wouldn't call it secondary or tertiary, but on another level, they are cinematic in the sense that, as what Rike was saying before, they are affective in two levels simultaneously. They actually make us move, so they refer to motion, because you see something that you can do or you're afforded to do in a room, you move and you do it. But also to emotion, so to this internal movement, the movement without moving. And basically he's claiming that all technology in that sense is cinematic. It makes us both move and be moved.
Yes, I think that, but this is to answer your question about this Hiroshima Mon Amour. I think that this is exactly because of this, because this biological memory sensation is a fluid, so almost by nature and essentially corrupt. It's such a highly subjective and affective capacity that in order to, let's say, to externalize this after the externalization has taken place already. So in the absence of the externalization itself, you can only talk about this really individual or trans-individual kind of subjectivity of the place itself, without the actual depiction or the actual involvement of what it is supposed to depict or to be reflecting on. And I think this difference in between these experiences, the natures of these memories, as Patrick also indicated, could be the starting point of the most interesting part of this discussion, because it all has to do about this. Because also, if you go back to the previous notion of, let's say, the biological unknowing, the unevolutionizing of some sort of linear progression, then it becomes more interesting, because how can you tell what is a future intention without knowing what is the effect of a previous future intention, if you know what I mean.
And if, for example, I mean, you have with Stephen Jay Gould and those people saying, that, Darwin requires an enormous, I mean, to put it very crudely, an enormous amount of time for all his differentiations to take place. But what happens if there are gaps and jumps and
there are. This is yeah. I mean,
because that seems to be what happens in our thinking. I mean, when we have an insight into something, we understand something.
That was the example of Hiroshima Mon Amour. It was that it is a gap. It is accelerating. It's accelerating our affective, emotional, and affective simultaneous understanding of a bomb dropping down in a manner much more profound than just waiting for it to settle into us, let's say, for hundreds of years.
Yeah. But this is on many levels. This is a practical knowledge in that sense, that this whole evolutionary unlinearity of time progression is not necessarily connected. I mean, this is let's say, if the surroundings are completely neutral, or let's say the white soft space, but there never are. So it is never like this. So it is always a variations of jump starts,
Yes,
like jumps and pushes. And so in that sense, this milieu, this surroundings can also be seen as a cinematic space where everything is compressed and pushed in a sense. And then if you would claim that you are the constant factor in a linear progression from birth to death, then you could say, yeah, well, then we are the most invariable form of life in comparison to our relation to the surroundings. But okay, there's maybe another discussion.
Is that what Andre means by affordances out of Gibsonian work, that we, I mean, at the very beginning, I see you're in what I take to be an etching or an engraving. It's, you mentioned rain, and I'd say, oh, and you said, oh, and then I thought afterwards, when we stopped speaking, oh, Hokusai, he shows the rain. But I pick up on that because I was brought up in a country where it rains almost every day, and I miss it sometimes, because at night, if it starts to rain in the city here, I almost feel there's a conversation going on, that the rain is pattering, it's trying to say something. So in this, if you like, anonymous phylum of rain, there is an it that seems to be doing something. It's not just as regnet, but this as is part of, which is the life of life.
And then the subject is derivative. I mean, you undergo these experiences, something happens, and then you realize
Exactly.
Well, I fell asleep, so I don't know who the subject is at that point.
Yes.
It was thanks to the idea of the soft murmur, the pitter patter of the rain. And all my life was in that hearing. You know, I mean, it's not that, it's not that I'm desiring a particular thing. It's not that the level is just a multiple of an earlier level. I'm in a new immersive, what I would call milieu, which is now.
Phivos, one of our guests, is making a nice point on that. Following the lesson on the machinic subconscious. And I don't know if you would like to say something in real life, but if not, no pressure. There's no need to. We can continue. But I think it ties nicely to what Patrick is describing right now.
What is it? I'm trying to remember the piece of information we got from a scientist who is literally like hard sciences measuring the synoptic traffic. You remember, he comes up with this fascinating piece of information that it's only if it's just I'll try to simplify it. If there is such thing as input in terms of information, what you see, it only accounts for 10% of synoptic connections at every single time. So that is to say that our, when Deleuze says that our perception is hallucinatory,
the synapses, yeah.
It's actually literally so. And I'm reinforcing your comment on the milieu and affordances. So it's not a sandwich of input-output. It's much more. Perhaps it has to do with, Stavros was referring to the Bergsonian cone, different levels of contraction and the opposite.
I think it's also the shock that much of what is the life of life is we have defined already as non-living.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really our problem throughout. I mean, without going into a pan-psychic view of a sort of Neoplatonic view of the world, we are just,
And Patrick, by extension, also the memory that is not being lived by anybody.
Yes.
I think that's a nice way to go to the next topic, which is the digital.
Could I ask a question? So,
yes.
Because I think what was interesting is like that in a sense we skipped something over between the second and the third already, which I think would be interesting to elaborate to make the step to the fourth question. And that is that we went from surroundings to architecture with actually discussing their difference. No? And I think what was interesting and what Patrick was just saying on what Andrej was saying about our constitution of subjectivity that is produced through selection processes, not only evolutionary, but also just, let's say, in our own living or so, and also like not just genesis, but also our own becoming. So they're both processes where, let's say, the living is constituted through selection processes, and they are responsiveness or responsibilities to environments. And the actual interesting effect with the cinematic then, I think, and also with architecture is that those are in a sense adaptations of existing surroundings that have been historically produced, but let's say we are in constant processes of adapting them. And we adapt them actually in order to change our becomings. Also, it's like the projection of photons on a surface in which you sit so that you absorb them and they blind out other things so that the 10% that you perceive are altered. So those spaces are always spaces that, of course, are modulating perception. Therefore, they're modulating becomings and genesis. And I think what is very interesting is actually that in architecture, to make the role to what architecture is, there is a very long trajectory from Vitruvius onwards with the idea of theaters, that those are spaces produced to modulate our affections, spaces that lead to us becoming different persons, like the idea of catharsis also, like that it changes our fluxes, our affective fluxes. And then of course, Guattari was involved actually in a research on what cities do, where they derived the idea that then was used in 1,000 Plateaus, that cities are correlates of the roads because they structure fluxes. That's where economies emerge from spatial structuring operations. And I think to also bring that to the question of digitization and then later on proletarianization, I think that the thing with architecture is, of course, that the way it participates in these modulations and therefore in transindividuations is not always just good. Transindividuation evolution is not just by default amazing, but because it reduces space of possibilities, it also has the danger of locking us into systemic stupidities in autopilot. And that's actually like the idea of the hypomnemata as a sublimation is in the moment that you exteriorize it or you give it away, you also stop habituating yourself and creating the knowledge that pertains to this form of production. So you lose that form of production by it structuring you. So it becomes subconscious, and therefore it becomes subconsciously exteriorized into the, let's say, what we call the built environment. And I think that's a very interesting thing concerning architecture. So it can be understood in let's say, this as a structuring operation that we then, in a sense, forget about.
I think that's beautiful. And there's also the issue of, again, go back to Giordano Bruno, there's Camilo's famous theater of memory, because there's a fatal connection between space and memory, which I think is partly the issue of the milieu again, and it's also the way in which the Bergsonian cone tries to understand that memories are there, are waiting. There is an exosomatic memories, and what Andrej said. So I think that that's really, but what if somebody said to you, indeed, Robert, that is very interesting, but if I'm a craftsman or making things very skillfully, I need forgetting. Part of the skill of making is that I'm not encumbered by going through all the steps again. I've learned certain things. So the problem solving and the creating of concepts is the way in which the philosophical understands how we deal with the issue of our one day not existing or there being no time for us.
I think that is exactly I think you're hitting the nail on the next question, because that's the question about, let's say, the digital and digital governance that, for example, also Antoinette Rouvois talks about. And also, like, where is like the fine line between, let's say, automatisms that help us and systemic stupidities? I think there's a very, very interesting fine line. And then to question, let's say, the role of architecture and these kind of structures in there, I think that's a really interesting question.
You should write a paper, Robert, called Artificial Stupidity, a question, yes?
If I may intervene, because it's interesting, and I'm trying to push it to the digital, you mentioning automation, Robert, because Stiegler would say, and I mean, also Benjamin Bratton says the same, following a bit Stiegler in there, that automation is a mistake that we have connected only to recent contemporary digital practices. According to Bratton, for example, a toilet is an automation. Toilet is automating the whole movement, let's say, of going literally and picking up with a bucket your leftovers and throwing them outside of your house. We have just automated that thing into pushing just one button. So automation should not be connected just with recent digital, so-called digital practices. And if we open up automation much more broader, and then we try to bring it to the digital, I think something that we were discussing with Andrej the other day, the problem that recently Stiegler was having with the digital is that he's claiming that essentially it becomes a question of knowledge, as we will see in the last slide, in the last question. A question of knowledge in the sense, Stiegler's basic issue was how can we have power over power? So Stiegler is saying, but we can go to the previous one before we end up there. Stiegler was saying that all these means of technological automation are power, okay? How can we have power over them? And the problem he has with the digital is, as he puts very nicely in his last book, is that if all we are speaking about is memories, creativity, any other thing that happens supposedly in our brain, our nerves are communicating with each other, information is spreading in our brain at the speed of 50 meters per second, okay? In the fiber optic lines in the Atlantic Ocean, data and information is speeding at the speed of 200 million meters per second. So it's, I don't know how many billion times faster than our nerves. That puts us in a position where indeed we have to really find out a way that we can actually allow ourselves not to fall into the victimization, let's say, that Robert was describing, of being clocked into this ultimate and never-ending mode of stupidity, where we are overpowered.
Which neuromarketing is taking advantage of, and people who understand this. I think so the speed, it's a matter of speed, as you rightly point out, but also I think tied to this discussion is also, he wants to retain this distinction in Kant, between understanding and reason. The fact that understanding is always analytic, it's about exactitude. And reason is beyond that, it's syntactic. And he says there is no space for that kind of deliberation with the contemporary automata. They just happen too fast and simply short circuit any possibility for us to think.
But we can think of ratio as both reason in the sense of logic, but also we can think of ratio as proportionality. And what creates proportionality is also something to do with our body. So it is a struggle with the somatic and exosomatic. So that's a very dynamic idea of measure, which doesn't necessarily follow the route of the logical in itself. But I think the point that I find very interesting here, it's very rich, is that in Homer, for example, the Phaeacians, it is an automatic ship that brings Odysseus home, finally. It's actually, there are these magical automata, and this idea of the automata has to do with both, self-active movement. Part of Turing's problem is that there cannot be an infinity for the machine. Problem is that our thinking doesn't come at speed. It's immediate, it's now. So when I have a thought, I can't think in terms of the time it took to have that thought. My thinking itself is always an immediacy of the present. And whatever I'm now going to say, I cannot create without a kind of remorseless reiterative loop what the next sentence I will say is. So here in the very feature of thinking and speech, there is something about the nature of the automatic and time that I think really the digital doesn't really, isn't capable of dealing with. I mean, it just simply isn't.
If I can I just read from his lectures, Nanjing lectures. This is literally the last thing that he wrote. He's referring at one point to toxicity, I think.
Toxicity.
Toxicity, yes. So he says it's possible to exploit the toxic power of tertiary retention, and through that to take the control of psychic apparatuses by taking control of cerebral and drive-based automatisms and compulsions. In that case, instead of inscribing the psychic apparatus onto the circuits of transindividuation, the internalization of tertiary retention short circuits the cerebral elaboration emerging from the attentional forms acquired through education, and triggers archaic automatisms outside any noetic channeling. This is, of course, he says, the whole point of neuromarketing. So in automated society, automated understanding becomes purely computational, and in so doing, short circuits the function of reason. The function of reason here in terms of he's referring to Whitehead's book, Function of Reason. One lovely book.
But if I may, I mean, what Patrick was describing and what you're also trying to say is that, I mean, what Patrick was mentioning, I mean, I understand it, and we did the seminar last year on Ruyer. I understand what Ruyer was calling the absolute survey, okay? I mean, our brains operate in this almost, I mean, it's speedless because it's infinite. I mean, we can literally survey our whole life in the split of a second. And that cannot be ever matched by any automated process. The problem is, there is a discrepancy there. Our absolute survey in terms of our brains, whatever that might be, is always on the virtual. It's always on the what if, it's always on the potential. Nonetheless, we also live a life that is connected with an automation process happening at extremely more fast, let's say, speeds right now, which is the actual itself, okay? I mean, no matter what you're thinking, you still have to hit a button to have a toilet running. Stiegler's point would be, how can these two reconciliate with each other? How can we take care, that's the neganthropic element, is how can we take care of technology so that both of them can flourish in a way? So million flowers in the Maoist sense can flourish.
Well, it goes back, I mean, to that question of setting upon, herausfordern. Heidegger takes that term with respect to, you know, the mill or the production of things, and whether that, you know, we, through quantity or through the notion of measure as exactitude, we turn everything into just that. And I mean, Heidi translated the word Gestell in her essay, I remember, as a skeleton, which I quite liked, because it's not a, or, you know, it's not, normally we tend to think of it as Bestand, like what we have with a computer. We can see that there are certain functionalities and operations available. My idea is, though, that the language itself already constitutes the vast anonymous objectivity of memory, all language, all words spoken, everything said, and that we enter into that the moment we start thinking and speaking. But at the very moment we start speaking, I don't have the next word on my lip.
Yeah.
Creates that next word is very often image, or it's just a habitude of usage, or it's the deep grammar that informs how I look at things.
This is, I think, what Stavros meant by, so language in that sense would be virtual.
Yes.
And algorithms would be always actual.
Yes.
But we need both. We need both.
That's can you say that again?
I was trying to kind of distill.
Language would always be virtual and algorithms would be actual.
That's the problem, because algorithms cannot not be actual, because they calculate. And Deleuze famously says in Difference and Repetition, God calculates, but luckily he always makes mistakes. I think precisely because it's the matter of virtuality.
But it's the unknown that's driving the known. It's and also it seems to me that the, you know, what we're talking about is there in language is, for me, I mean, it's endlessly rich. What you know, when you think of the caves, imagine you wake up and you have language, and but who are you speaking to? How does the other person have language? Well, that puts maybe the question wrongly, because language is there and we entered it. Because otherwise there would be an impossible moment of first communication.
Maybe if I can just, there's one more thing I'm dying to say this, because I did insert it into the introduction, but there was no way I could develop it further. You could say that there is this, and it comes from Guattari, at least for me. The idea is that the algorithm can do everything, all the cover can be understood in terms of all the Aristotelian causalities except for the final one, in the sense that it's effective, it's material, it's efficient, formal, but not final, because this finality that we are describing, that Patrick is describing when he says, I don't know what I'm going to say next, it's the associated milieu. It's the fact that constitutes itself on the go. So this virtuality is a product of immanence. It is quasi-causal in the sense that it does offer a kind of the direction, a sense, but that sense, it's not totalizing. It cannot. I mean, any and every calculation always is based on the total. It's a matter of probability. It is still, we can distinguish between in that sense with every calculation. It's probably in the sense that probability can be calculated only upon the whole. And here the whole is fleeting. It's not off the parts. It's alongside the parts. It's next to parts. It's of the virtual we're describing. And that's why I think we are at impasse. It becomes very difficult to talk about.
I see both Jorge and Marc want to add something. So you decide. You decide your turn.
Well, yeah, my colleague will go first. So yeah.
No, you go first. Should I go? No, I just would like to. I've been listening to everything, and I would like to say that Stiegler talks about a French word, penser, which means thinking with care, and he says that this is the opposite of calculation, meaning that calculation is related to algorithm, and algorithm is related to entropy. And the only way to go into negentropy is to go into this kind of reasoning that he understands is a kind of thinking with care, which means is bringing, I understand, is not just reason, but bringing some kind of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, this is my interpretation. Huh?
Yes, and la pensée, for example, also has a pun involved. When Lévi-Strauss talks about la pensée sauvage, it can also mean a wild flower, a pansy. So, you know, the wild flower of thought, the efflorescence of blooming, which again will bring us back to a rhizomatic version of how everything influences, how we're constantly being influenced. And even in this talking together, we're creating this virtual milieu, which changes us. And I mean, so I think that's really part of how the notion of the open within the event is installed philosophically as the key way in which the experience of time actually occurs for us, as a horizon of what is open, of us as project. But I think one should go back to what Robert was saying earlier, because I think that question of automatism and habit and repetition and the architectural also plays with this idea around alienation and proletarianization. I don't quite understand. I thought that the proletariat was disappearing, but you know, I thought it was a new service economy with a new slavery was actually what was happening. That there isn't a class in the Marxist sense. There is a mass. There is a kind of phylum of slavery being introduced, intensified by lack of technical know-how and skills.
Can I?
Marc wanted to say something.
Marc, sorry, apologies.
Yeah.
Sorry, excuse me. Yeah.
Of course, every second my question also changes on the basis of what is being said here. But also, I wanted to go back to what was Robert's comment about this theater as a starting point, and I wanted to sort of tie this together, because I think this sort of inherent fear of the digital, which I sense in some of the participants' voice. I don't see this as so much as a threat. I mean, if we talk about the cave paintings, then we could also say this technological empowerment of information has also the ability to exceed our lifespan by thousands of years. So I mean, this is not like, so the technological will always be 1,000 times slower or faster than we are, but still it is readable. So I think that the understanding of and introducing the thinking with care, this affective quality is really interesting. And to make a sort of a very physical analogy, also maybe hoping to lure some other participants into the discussion, was when Robert was saying, okay, this theater as an affective space where you are, let's say, it is built to create some sort of affective quality to arouse you in some way. That also means if you would take this literally, then all the other spaces would be only the facilitating spaces for this affective space. So the rest of the city would be then, let's say, in service of this elitist little cave, artificial, modern Scientology, no, Scientology also, but scientific case, which is enabled by the proletariat, if in slavery form or nothing. I mean, it's then only the question: are you in the theater or are you in the rest of the spaces? But still, and I think that is where we are going to, within the theater. And this is also this was a practice in the former colonies of the Netherlands, is that you had, let's say, the expensive tickets, which would sit. The people would sit in front of the screen, seeing it in the right dimensions and in the right order, and also the subtitles in the right way. And you had the secondary tickets, which put you behind the screen, looking at the shine through on the white thing, of course, being unable to read the subtitles because it would be in mirror, and also seeing the whole thing in a very confabulated way because it was not the actual image. So I think that this matter of perception, and then even one step further, how to connect, let's say, the outside into the theater to the first and the secondary perception, that would be also interesting to see from, okay, what is the more let's say the direct political implications of this. And I know that I will almost jeopardize my friendship with Andrej by luring a sort of political flatness into this discussion. But I was also thinking of Sjoerd Elodie's work on the gaze and the gaze multiple, and I was wondering if we could, in some way, attach, let's say, this question of being inside the theater or not, or being in front of the screen or on the backside, could be, let's say, connected to what is this gaze in this respect. So maybe you would like to join us to comment a little bit on this.
And now the question is, who is going to say what, Elodie or I?
Both. You can work it out. Come on.
I must say, just to say something about what I have heard until so far. It's like with a radio, and you're trying to tune in, and you're you're capturing sounds, and you try to make something out of it. That's what I have been doing for the past an hour plus. So it's on my side understanding parts of your conversation, actually. And that also has to do with me not being able to read Stiegler extensively. Let's say I have not read a text until now, really. So that having said, I think I've written 4 pages down with with quotes, but also with ideas of what I have been hearing. And well, maybe to jump on your remark, Marc, about the theater itself and the screens, the multi-perspective. Earlier on, when you were all talking about milieu and being in the middle, I also had to think about the multiplicity of the gaze, which is the subject of our research. Because where is the milieu made of when you are experiencing it? So milieu is only there if you can be there as well with it. So if you can experience it, and how can one do that?
I think it's nice that you mention it, because it ties to that last question, that last slide, because also that, I mean, I'm going to try now to artificially bring everything together, but it's not so artificial. They're actually connected, all the things that have been mentioned. From Patrick's first comment to what Marc was mentioning about the different positions, to what you're saying about the milieu now, what Stiegler is saying about this term of proletarianization, which he takes it, I would say he takes it directly. I mean, he just changes slightly the names from Simondon, who in the mode of existence of technical objects was saying against Marx, that Marxist, let's say, understandings of alienation are very diminished, are very, let's say, narrow focused, because they focus on a mode of alienation, which is just one of a much broader mode of alienation, which is technological alienation. Again, if we understand technology as any environmental manipulation, so as any way that we intervene in our environment, and therefore technology producing our ways of life, if we don't know anything about technology, or we have very limited knowledge about technology, we essentially don't know how our life is produced. So much more than the question of, is it in front of a screen or on the side, I suppose that Simondon or Stiegler would say that you cannot know. I mean, because you might be on the back side of a screen and still be aware, still have literacy, let's say technologically speaking, of what's going on, which therefore makes you much less alienated to what you're experiencing.
Stavros, I think that's a really very interesting point. I have been using a slide in a lectures I give, where I show actually the photographing of the Lascaux cave, the first expedition, going down with technical equipment, with apparatuses to represent or try to represent or photograph the Lascaux cave. And then you see these people lying on the ground and trying to, have the right vantage point or angle, and it's just not there. There is no angle. There is no perfect spot where you can view everything. It is around you.
Parabolic space, of course.
Yes. So it's always, I mean, it is subjective. Always, there is no, I mean, objectivity just does not exist in this space. Yeah. There is no perfect spot. Even so, there are also, theories that the space, the undulating surfaces and the representations of animals are actually put in certain places where by moving through the space, there is actually a transformation happening. So these are really very good points to also take into account when we go out of the cave, as we are now, that when we walk in the world, or when we are in a milieu, that we don't know from which side we are
that's
experiencing it.
That's Stiegler's point, that I mean, tying to what Marc was saying, I mean, being illiterate technologically and alienated, in the end, you don't really care if it's in front of a screen or back of a screen. Everything becomes homogeneous. Everything becomes in the social media style, everything is a matter of quantifiable likes, dislikes, or posts. There's full-on homogeneity, while Stiegler is saying, or Gökhan would continue saying, it should be a matter via thinking and doing things with care, as Korte was mentioning. How can we introduce a certain techno-diversity? We have the capacity to diversify, neganthropologically diversify, and yet we are locked into a position that we are not diversifying, we're homogenizing. Andrej.
Let me just, before we give it to LOD, because I think I just want to follow up on what you said, and I've written down this little extract also from his lectures, where he's talking about Stiegler is talking about what is a proletarianized designer. That would be very probably interesting for us. So what is a proletarianized designer? He says it's a manipulator of concepts derived from automated understanding, devoid of the synthesis that emerge from this automatizing reason. or neganthropic movement. In other words, he says, devoid of capacities for synthesizing pretension, converging towards a kingdom of ends. This is what Revoix is talking about when she is writing about algorithmic governmentality. So he says that automatic pretensions replace any synthesis not calculable by analytical understanding. Consequently, they replaced what I refer to as the Rouillet's neofinalism, Deacon's teleodynamics, or DNG's quasi-causation. So finally, he says the proletarization of all forms of knowledge causes the generalization of functional noetic deficiencies that result in noetic cretinism.
Or in other words, we all start desiring the same way.
Yes, 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 and this is entropy at its worst. Everything is flat.
It would be well worth looking at how, for example, the statistical statistics is now the science, if you like, because of a false political version of democracy. If 72 million people think this, then 73 million people are wrong, or whatever, or vice. So statistics has become the way in which the Herausforderung, in the Heideggerian sense, the actual Gestell operates.
That Kangian talks about this in the normal and pathology.
Oh, good. Well, then I don't need to go on. It seems to me that that's well worth looking at, how, Quetelet's measurements of his children and creating physical statistics and life cycles and quotients. And so milieu is not to meson, it's not in the middle. Milieu is between.
That's a good point. And they are pushing us to the meso.
And they want us always in that sort of, and that's a pseudo politics, if you like, for me. Because actually, when you hear this conversation, if I may say with respect, I'm still in chapter 7 of the Res Publica. I'm still in Plato's cave. And, I still have the problem of how my confusion is such that I am capable. What made that prisoner who was there shackled, unable to move, facing in one direction to the cast shadows which were coming from afar from behind where he was sitting onto a screen in front? How did that prisoner get out of that? What was the trigger?
Jorge wanted to say something or not?
I guess, if I can, I would like to say that Stiegler talks about Alan Greenspan as the wealthiest proletarian in the world, because when he goes to the Senate after the 2008
having an affair
crisis,
with Ayn Rand. That makes she was the wealthiest proletarian in the world. Rand, yes. His mistress. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So he thank you. See, he says that basically the entropy of algorithm is dominating through big data is the whole economic system. So it becomes a part of capitalism.
Yeah.
And he links this connection with Marx, the idea of alienation through machine. He says we have a new contemporary system through big data, and the way to find an escape out of this system is to go into what he calls negentropy, the system of negentropy.
It's funny, but this ties back to what Simondon was saying all over since 1958, I think so, yeah. And we're discussing 2 years ago on the seminar we did in Simondon about the so-called magical unity, which is actually the coming together of aesthetics, technology, ideology, coming back together in one technical culture, so not being apart. But this Simondon was suggesting, and I think both me and Andrej were finding it a bit strange even to understand, but philosophy is what can bring all this together. So thinking, creating concepts can bring all this together. And I'm saying so because if you go to all different opening up new chairs on digital stuff, I mean, digital this, digital that, algorithmic this, algorithmic that, all what they're focusing on is not evaluating them or re-evaluating them or challenging them. It's just how they can make them more efficient. That's the main focus now. So how can you become even more algorithmic than the algorithm itself?
Yes, because the only causality is efficient causality. There is no other causality. I mean, if it works, I mean, you can go to hospital and get how this vaccine works may not be clear, but it works. So that's enough for people.
Elodie, please go ahead. We promised.
Well, I was thinking actually when I read this, how does technological illiteracy lead to technological alienation? That's what I'm discussing with my students actually every time I talk about technology and how to use cameras and digital technology and how to try to find a way around what Flusser is calling the apparatus to work against the cameras and digital things. So I think I see that artists and people making images are quite, you could say, opportunistic when it comes to this. So just trial and error and seeing where you end up. And I think sometimes that's maybe what is needed to be to have this kind of accidents going on, to understand that technology is not something you should actually be very reverent of, to revere it. I see that the young generation is really having this idea of technology is something so high and so so important that they don't think they can change anything to it. So yes, in my research, I also see that when I describe the way I work as an artist, it's just trying to making sense of having relays, to use a word Andrej is using very often, to have this relays between the technological and the non-technological. And I think that is actually what is design. I would say that for me, that is design or art.
I was just reminded earlier, Heidi was mentioning Brian Masumi. I'm thinking, but I picked up from both of them, him and Manning, this idea that you're describing, and I immediately see it as a matter of abduction. What if, because we don't know in advance. The algorithmic way would be if then. So if I put this, then it's that. But what if it requires tinkering, it requires intervention, it's hands-on, and it's something that it's a different, it's a very different technology, the technicity.
It's worth saying that with the atomic bomb invention, Heidegger tries to reflect on what happens when you have an atomic age, or you have an information age, or you define the age as the Iron Age through its big technologies, etc. And he sets that against what he takes to be the history of being, physical history, if you wish. However, he also wants to say that where the danger is, there's the saving grace, quoting Hölderlin, and points us to something which I think is still valuable in his Die Frage nach dem Technik, which is, what is the capacity for the technological to cover up what it actually does in terms of, through efficient causality, creating this level of homogenization and of dullness, if you like, for individual people and their prospects of life. So there is a political program in that question, I suspect, somewhere. And the question for us then is, like if you look at the Senate committee trying to get Mark Zuckerberg to answer a simple question, he keeps saying, well, we will talk about that later. Well, let's get into a closed room and discuss that. So things are just becoming completely absurd. He doesn't know his own company. He doesn't know that there is a platform deliberately used to invade and investigate all the usages of the machinery. He doesn't realize that preferences are based on statistics, that they can be completely manipulated in a kind of pseudo-democracy of opinion. And this, I mean, I could go on and I shouldn't, but it's after 4 o'clock. But, like, we have to understand in what way this technology is given to us as something very pristine and something very emancipatory and liberating and something that's going to offer us so much. And actually it's covering up how it works all the time. And our task must be, I think, in a way, is the uncovering of that. Now, this question of proletarianization, I find very difficult.
I think maybe what could help is when we talk about the proletarianization of the designer there, no? Because as what you just said, I think becomes, in terms of the Anthropocene or the Neganthropocene being supposedly the time where, let's say, the consciousness of design becomes even more important, no? And how that contradicts actually with its with technological illiteracy. And then maybe to add like a slightly critical note there, I think that that feeling that you have towards proletarianization, I think I share, because let's say what is more important, I think what you have mentioned before is, let's say, the very basic Stoic notion of techne as like that through which we become who we are, no? So like the different techniques through which we become who we are. And class, how technology is connected to class differences, is of course just one of these kind of things. I mean, there's a myriad of other kind of sociogenetic and anthropogenetic differentiations that Stiegler is actually never accounting for, because he's a very, let's say, androcentric thinker. So he doesn't actually account for, let's say, the notion of anthropogenesis as, for example, Sylvia Wynter would define it, or Catherine yourself, which would argue that technologies, of course, also create and put people at multiple layers. Now, as Rosie Bradotti would say, we are, like, we also, what Stavros said before, we design in the same way, but we also critique in the same way, and we generalize critiques in the same way. And proletarianization as a concept, I think, is one of these generalizations, which an intersectional approach could, for example, specify much more. By saying we are not precarianized in the same way, and more other people are more precarianized and intersectionalized and let's say drawn away from other things more than others. And therefore, let's say this kind of relationship to design and how design spatial organizations help generate and create these short circuits where, let's say, these intersectionalities are produced, I think is very interesting. And I think the question there is actually heterogenesis. How design, like we have a technological illiteracy, how design is inherently heterogenetic. It creates differences. No, it's like from inside and outside, living room, toilet, private, public. Design is the way in which we structure differences. We produce differences. And then, of course, the question is that we have a complete unawareness to these kind of social influences. And I mean, I find it always like super astonishing that I say it starts with Vitruvius, how these things, in a sense, there is a technological awareness to that we have forgotten. And over the past 100 years, architects have argued with, let's say, sociologists that there is such a thing as like spatial and architectural determinism. Now, that it affects us. And now suddenly everybody is like, oh yeah, space affects us. No, how could we forget about it? But I think that's a very interesting idea. Is like, how could we, like, how is this kind of the precarianization of this architectural knowledge? How can that help, in a sense, maybe open up new futures? And to do that also by actually complementing, as I was insinuating, Stiegler from, let's say, a multiplicity of other potential angles.
I think that the Stoical, again, the poor technicon that they talk about is mind itself. And so it's really, my point earlier about language and thinking is becoming, and the is there is sur nature in the Derridian sense. So that we're not heading to alienation and proletarianization, we're heading to a new precariousness in which architecture is being asked, for example, as Baudrillard did, to provide spatial therapy, or, you know, to create experiences for people who don't have or are becoming incapable of experience. because the kind of, if you like, the space that allows you to reflect and the time you need for that is considered wasted time. Now, maybe our lockdown is helping a lot of people realize that, you know, there's a lot more time than we ever imagined. And it can drive us mad. I mean, there's a very interesting coming in touch with one's own way of being, the way of being the first thing I noticed was when the first lockdown from March the 13th, that for about 2 weeks, everybody was saying, oh, the air has become so pure and there's no traffic noise and there's no aeroplanes. And what I noticed was that they were showing photos as if we were in the Russian Marxist catastrophe of empty supermarket shelves. And to go back to Stavros's example, toilet paper no longer available, leak guts becoming uncleanable, and so there was a kind of slow horror being presented to us, and that we would inevitably, you know, behave according to our worst instincts. It's well worth reflecting on how all this experience and the usage of online and Zoom, and Heidi made a wonderful pun 10 days ago about we've all become zombies for zombies. So I'm interested in that, how the zombie and us, I'm alive but behave like a zombie is dead but looks like it's alive. That seems to be a core question throughout the whole of the discussion, if I may offer that as a final comment.
Since we agreed to keep it only till 4:30 in case we went over, is Heidi, Mark, anybody else, do you want to have any famous last words or not?
Excuse me.
Yes, of course, we want to have the last word. Question is, do they contribute anything at this point? I think that for me, the interesting overlap could be between, to summarize maybe a little bit of the last discussion part, is where we see this technological, not only in its, let's say, its hardware capacity, its metaphorical hardware capacity, or its translation into the digital, but more as a system of systemization of the life itself. Then we could also, to use Patrick's term, say that we have created a magical automata or multiple magical automatations for our life as such. And then if I tie this to what Elodie was mentioning in educational sense, you could also question yourself in what sense we have already constructed the life for the human, for the biological to fit in that sense, because in evolutionary terms, you would never be able to fit into the first grade of the secondary school if you were not biologically ready for that. So you better be. So this is also like, say, a sort of a jump between the hillocks in the epigenetical kind of sense, that you have to make these pushes in order to fit in what we then call maybe the society. And I don't want to call it a society because it is more like a technological environment of interdependencies. And then referring back to Patrick's remarks about the first lockdown situation, it became so clear that we have become a one world, but not in a McLuhan sense, but more in an interdepending sense. That if in China the production stops, we don't have any supplies left, and we are not even able to manifest anything which could help us in this situation. So that complete gridlock of social technological interdependencies, that this is for me one of the nightmares, which is also connected to the vision of the digital, because, and now we come back to what was Stavros's point, is that we can never oversee these complexities as good as the complexities can oversee themselves. But because they are technological by nature, exterior entities in itself, they will never take the time to think with care. maybe even they're not able to do this. And I think that is for me the only, let's say, dystopian element of this, because I think that there is also a very utopian side of it, because if you then talk about this sort of the empty shelves in the supermarkets, I think that was a really nice moment for me in terms of cleansing. It is like, okay, so how much do you need? You individual person, you're forced by, this is a force of nature, but a self-created nature in that sense. And that also ties back to what is the surrounding is if you're not in there, and what is the milieu if you're not part of it. And so I think for me, this whole discussion has been a sort of a magical automation of thought, and I thank you very much for joining us and myself for joining you. Sorry.
Andrej, do you want to give your closing remarks, and then we can go have a coffee in toilet, each one of us?
Yes, very, very quickly. I take the point that Bob was making. For me, non-anthropo-genesis is has to become heterogenesis, the project of heterogenesis. And I'm reminded, I've recently heard an interview with Nick Land, who says, I could never, ever, ever foresee what happened from the 1990s, the promise of the cyberpunk, the new digital technologies, and from cyberpunk in the 90s to Facebook in the noughties. It is the project of disindividuation. So bringing us all closer to the mean. And I think there is I identify this also in architectural schools, this kind of idea of somehow optimization equals disindividuation equals bring us to the mean, has to be resisted by any and every means. That will be my last.
I absolutely agree.
Well, it's been wonderful to participate and to continue the responses to Stiegler. I should mention, I mean, there's the beginning of that discussion took place, in fact, in Designing the Urban that Gerhard Browns edited along in 14 years ago. And the whole relationship between Stiegler, Heidegger, and Deleuze was brought up in an early essay by me, and Heidi then also was dealing with Benjamin. And so, I mean, it is very interesting to think that, 15 years later, this is much more moot, I mean, in a way, and so much so that I even endured watching Mark Zuckerberg being interviewed by the Senate Committee for some hours via YouTube. So there we are.
To finish with the last product placement, if you liked what you shared today, we're going to have a seminar for a whole semester on Stiegler in a much broader way. We are not going to, I think we're going to read only one text of Stiegler. So all the rest are going to be by non-Stieglerians, but eventually we'll bring together to the concept of tertiary memory. It's going to start on February, and in our Facebook page, you can find more information about it, or just mail Andrej or me.
Very good. I'm going to leave now and thank everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice seeing you. Nice having you.
Mark, Andrej.
Thank you. I really enjoy it.
Hey, Enrique.
Very interesting.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
I have all my thoughts here.
What is also interesting to see is Renzo, when he left this Zoom, the autocorrect, you can see it in the chat.
Yeah.
He says, thanks a lot. Unfortunately, I have to live.
To live. Yes, indeed, to live.
Long lives to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Au revoir.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks for